mostly just an introduction anyway, and if others join us, they can more likely miss that. Welcome everyone. This is Dawn Thomany from Colorado State University, and this is the third in our series of Regional Economic Development Institute Rapid Response Live Reports. This week, of course, we're focusing on how we're seeing COVID differentially impact rural Colorado. And this is a discussion very much veered on some of the bigger trends, including economics, but we also will be having some later in May to talk about some of the more community-based issues as well. But let me give you, and we want to welcome, of course, today, Elizabeth Garner, our state demographer, who actually was also a student of our programs way back when I started in the 90s. So I've gotten to have a very nice professional relationship with her for a very long time. And she's here to answer your questions today. So let me just frame this discussion by saying that our intention with these is to give you as quick of a storyline as possible about what's going on around our state, and today particularly about rural Colorado, partly through data and some applied research we did, but also through some questions and answers we'll leave plenty of time for, because we also want to know what's going on in your neck of the woods, so we know if there's places we should be giving more attention as well. So that's what the intention of today's report is. Next slide.
Hold on. For whatever reason. Oh, sorry. There we go.
Just to give you a little more background about the Regional Economic Development Institute, we're an applied research center on campus that is a joint effort between the Department of Economics and the Department of Ag and Resource Economics, including Stefan Weiler, who you'll hear from today, who's my co-director, and myself. But in addition to that, more recently, with CSU's new focus on extending extension to be even a larger set of engagement, we've gotten the challenge to actually start integrating more with the community development team for extension and looking to the entire campus for places we can have an engaged impact on the state. And so we actually have a set of research associates within the center as well who stretch far beyond our department's boundaries. And that's part of what we're trying to harness here to share more information with our community about what we already know and what we can help them learn about if it helps them adjust to major events like COVID. Next slide. So this is just a little bit of our mission statement. And again, just so that you know that beyond the topics we've been covering the last few weeks, we're open to a fairly broad set of applied research that might support your community development efforts. This webinar series is being led by Stefan, Becky Hill, who's also online and managing the webinar, and myself. And I would say the one real intersection we always want to be aware of is how applied economics can help us think of creative ways to bridge rural urban places, because that's a particularly acute challenge for Colorado. So we thought with the unfortunate events that are happening right now related to COVID, it was a good time to also think hard about what the story is in Denver, of course, which we're hearing about pretty actively, but what those stories look like out in rural parts of Colorado as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to today's primary speaker, Dr. Stefan Weiler, for the Department of Economics and from our center to talk a little bit about rural economies in the era of COVID. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Stefan.
Thanks very much, Dawn. I appreciate the introduction. So today we'll be, as Dawn said, talking about Colorado's rural economies in particular. And we're going to talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, obviously, COVID-19. But I also want to think about a future perspective, because there will be a future beyond COVID-19. And think about particularly the future of rural areas, because in some ways the interesting part of this crisis is it's been largely centered in cities, and it may actually make cities less attractive in the long term for folks. I already want to give a shout out to Elizabeth and her crew for the graphics are done by both us, but also we have taken several maps from the State Demography Office, which has a tremendous set of resources. So in brief, what we're going to cover is sort of three big areas. We're going to start with the national dynamics of the pandemic, just to give you a broad scope view of the rural areas in the US. Then take a look at rural Colorado's economic position within all that context. and then key aspects of rural resiliency, because there's rural areas and rural economies I think are a lot more resilient than most people realize. So to start with, here's a map, and the areas, the dark areas are the urban areas, the colored areas are rural areas, and the rural areas in orange and in red are the ones where they've had at least one case of COVID so far. And this was in early April. So it's not like rural areas, their isolation has kept them hidden from the disease. It is already spreading and spreading fast. This map has become rapidly more orange over the course of the last few weeks. There's a difference in economic vulnerability for different types of counties. There are going to be several resources that we hot linked and highlighted that you can take a look at after the webinar. This one map is from Purdue, which measures broadband access and at-risk jobs. So places that have difficulties with remote work, that have relatively bad broadband access and have a number of at-risk jobs are considered the most vulnerable. And you'll notice that those are clustered largely around the Deep South. There are other ways of taking a look at vulnerability, which the Chamorro, for instance, is an example of. And again, those hot links can take you to them. One of the other lurking problems that we have is that the COVID-19 testing rates are generally lower in more rural states. And so on the bottom axis, you have the population percentage that is rural. And you'll notice that there's kind of a cluster in the lower right-hand side. And what that basically means is that the more rural the population, the less the COVID testing is occurring. So we know less, in fact, about what is going on, the dynamics of COVID in the rural areas. The link is to a very interesting sets of information from the Syracuse Learner Center, which I highly recommend. But in general, testing rates, both in rural and urban areas, lag what would be desired by public health officials. And the question is whether rural Colorado will experience a delayed outbreak. The interesting part is that actually we were on the lead, rural Colorado in part was on the leading edge. The unique experience of the mountain and resort communities in March was really was one of the leading factors, one of the leading areas in terms of the COVID crisis. So I have a frozen screen here for a second. Apologies. I apologize. My screen is frozen for a moment here, but we will. Okay, apologies here.
Stefan, if you've clicked on another place in Zoom, sometimes it stalls you being in PowerPoint to move it forward. So actively click on your PowerPoint again.
There we go. Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Dawn. Much appreciated. Apologies for the technological neophyte in me. So the testing rates are lower in more rural counties. So let's talk about now rural Colorado's economic position as a context for the COVID-19. So first of all, we'll talk about who is rural. We'll talk about demographics and why they matter. This is part of the reason that we have Elizabeth here, who's probably a premier expert on rural demography, both in the state and around the country. We'll talk about population, in-migration, and job growth, the economics that are driving rural areas. We'll take a look at earnings, the ag, mining, old drivers, and potential new ones. Education, the gig economy, which is actually a big feature in both rural and urban economy, and then jobs, particularly jobs, because that is one of the key pieces of the economic fallout that COVID has created, is the job loss at a rapid rate. And I believe that the COVID crisis requires some fresh thinking. I think particularly for rural areas, thinking about regions as complements rather than competitors, rather than having communities compete against each other, but rather collaborate. That rural actually has some real advantages in terms of lower costs, amenities, and access to a global market through information technology. And so the punchline is going to be that rural areas can leverage their assets, their advantages, and entrepreneurs in particular, to be able to survive both not only COVID, but thrive in the future. So here's a look at Colorado, and the government divides counties in two major forms, metro and non-metro. Metropolitan areas are known as urban areas. Those are in dark green. Those are based on cities with 50,000 or more. And as you'll notice, the dark green is mostly all along the Front Range, from Pueblo throughout Colorado Springs to Denver, all the way to Fort Collins. There is a new, relatively new metropolitan area in the Western Slope, Grand Junction, which has gotten bigger than 50,000, so it is now a metropolitan area as well. The non-metropolitan counties, the ones that aren't considered urban, are divided into micro and rural counties. Micropolitan areas are areas that are based on small cities, so between 10 and 50,000, like 10 Steamboat Springs, or Edwards, Glenwood Springs, Durango, Fort Morgan, Sterling. So those are basically sort of slightly larger rural counties. And then rural counties themselves, the ones in white, are based on towns of less than 10,000. So that's how we break out who is not rural and who is not. And what you'll notice is that this is the population projection by the Elizabeth's office between 2018 and 2015. And you'll notice that there's a clear, obvious trend that those who have are going to get more. In other words, those areas that already have large concentrations of population, namely the Front Range, Pueblo, particularly El Paso, up through Denver, Arapahoe, Adams, Well, Larimer, are going to continue to gain population at a rapid rate. The one exception is the one exception that we talked about, namely the metropolitan area on the Western Slope, namely Mesa County, which is also going to grow quickly. The reason why it grows quickly is because of net migration. Births and deaths are a relatively smaller factor in Colorado. Net migration is really what turns the tide in terms of population. And the areas in red are going to experience extremely strong in-migration rates in the longer term, and have since the Great Recession 2010 ended and up through 2018. And you'll notice that there's actually, even during that time, even over that near decade, there are actually places, mostly rural areas, that have actually lost population. The areas in light blue and dark blue are mostly rural areas that have lost population during that time frame. And the ones in yellow are the ones that are basically treading water. So again, many rural counties are experiencing at best even growth, and at worst declining growth in terms of population. Why do people move? What is causing migration? People are basically attracted by job growth, and that's been a big feature of the Front Range. And so what we focus on are regional economic drivers. Like, for example, in Colorado, two of the big ones are tech and tourism. And those regional economic drivers bring dollars into the region by selling goods like technology goods, software, et cetera, and services, things like tourism, to the outside. It brings dollars into the state. Now, ag and mining used to be rural job drivers, but they aren't the future. All areas, not only just rural areas, but urban areas, all areas that diversify beyond these historic sectors. Up through when I got here in the mid-90s, Colorado was known as basically a sort of an ag and extraction state. But that has changed remarkably over the 25 years that I've been in Colorado. The question is, what will be the new economic drivers in this setting? And maybe it's not so much a question of what, but who. It's the homegrown entrepreneurship is the one that actually reveals the strengths of the local economy. The successful businesses that actually survive and thrive, start hiring more workers, those are the ones, those giving the signal to the sectors and the industries that are likely to be strengths for your particular area. It used to be that one big smokestack could come in and save an entire town, but that's really unlikely these days. And big manufacturing plants, big coal mines and steel mills, they simply don't exist in that same form. And even if they do, they then tend not to hire as many workers. So one savior is unlikely for rural locations. What we're going to focus more on are sort of non-employers, basically people solo or their partners, micro businesses, basically people who have no employees, just themselves working. Those are the seeds of fresh job growth. And that seed analogy is something I'm going to use throughout the presentation. So as you'll notice, ag and mining, even in the most rural areas, represents less than 15% of earnings. Entertainment and recreation is much more important, particularly in micropolitan counties. And if you take a look at entertainment and recreation across manufacturing, tech, and trade and transportation, ag and mining are a relatively small feature. And agriculture really is a relatively small part of the story for rural Colorado, especially for the Western Slope. This is a map of recreation-dependent counties in the United States. You'll notice that many of the green ones that are the recreation-dependent counties are in Colorado, particularly on the Western Slope. And they are concentrated. Recreation-dependent counties, of the graphic on the right, with the bar graph, basically shows you that the recreation-dependent counties are largely small non-metropolitan counties. Nearly 20% of small non-metropolitan counties are recreation-dependent. Mining job swings have been legendary. This just shows you the sort of seesaw map of mining and extraction over the years. And especially lately, when the oil price dives below zero, you know you've got a problem. And the oil sector and the gas sector have been dropping workers very quickly in this most recent downturn. So mining is unlikely to be a big source of a big driver in the future. So what does drive growth? Well, for one thing, education tends to drive growth. Having a more educated population, you'll notice there's a positive relationship between counties that have more high school diplomas, more bachelor's degrees, more doctorate degrees. Those are the counties that tend to grow faster. The counties that grow more slowly are those that have fewer residents with less than high school diploma. And that's what leads to the job growth that has been occurring. This gives you an example of using 2006 as a basis. You'll notice that there was an uptick just before the Great Recession, that micro and rural counties really dove much more strongly than metropolitan counties. Metropolitan counties in Colorado recovered relatively quickly and have been growing really quickly over the last decade, whereas micropolitan and rural counties, it took them 5 years to just get back to even, and are growing relatively slowly relative to the metropolitan areas. And this map sort of underscores why. These are the jobs relative to the pre-recession peak. And so this has been basically 2018 jobs, which is the most recent data that we have. And that's 10 years after the Great Recession. Well, you'll notice that there have been many more jobs in the dark orange and bright red counties. But there's actually places that actually have fewer jobs than they had in 2005 to 2009. Those are in light blue, and in darker blue, those are areas that have actually have fewer jobs than in the recession, even after 10 years. And again, they're largely in rural places. So the question is, how do we grow jobs? I mean, there's clearly a job crisis in that sense. COVID is making it worse. And what is generally ignored is that startups and young businesses themselves are job engines, that the share of jobs created by young establishments is really quite extraordinary. In the US as a whole, the majority of job growth is created by firms that are aged 5 years or less and generally have less than 10 employees. So the majority of job growth is actually by young, small establishments. And it's particularly true in Colorado. If you take a look at the red bar graphs, those are the young firms aged 0 to 5. Though Colorado outdistances the United States by a fair amount in terms of share of jobs created by these young establishments. And I'm comparing it to California. California is known as being a job machine, largely through the tech sector, but Colorado outpaces even California in that respect. So there is an emerging micro-entrepreneur, and the fact is we've had these micro-entrepreneurs for a while. That's what I call non-employers. And it's just a fancy term for saying somebody who works on their own, who doesn't hire any employees. And those are by far the fastest growing establishments. Just to take a quick peek, this is the difference in speed. I'll take a look in solid. There's the non-employers, and the dash, there's the employers. And you'll notice that over about 20 years, that there's been far faster growth in non-employers than in employers. There's been this recent focus on the gig economy, but the fact is that self-employed contractor gigs have long been the norm for a lot of sectors. The gigs aren't all that new. They just are getting more attention these days. Construction, tax services, consulting, all of those were gigs even before the gig economy became well known. The trend has been that non-employer establishments and smaller employer establishments, those with less than 10 employees, are the ones that are trending. There's basically a smaller efficient scale for business, that you don't need an HR department, you don't need an accounting department. You have software that can do that. So you don't need big businesses to actually be efficient and produce. And even manufacturing, which used to be the big smokestack, the big companies used to be manufacturing, they have become single creator with these free fab printers. You can basically, you should be able to print your phone within the next 10 years or so. And that is turning manufacturing on its head too. 75% of all business establishments are non-employers. And the basic fact is it's logical. I mean, very few businesses start with hiring workers. It's basically solo or partners that get companies started. If they succeed, then they start hiring workers. Those are the seeds. These folks who start their own businesses, they're the seeds for eventual employment growth, because 10 to 20% of non-employers become employers. REDI has done several different studies, and one of the key results is the fact that 10 to 20% is pretty solid, that basically up to a fifth of non-employers are the ones seeding the eventual hiring that goes on with employer firms. So here's again the comparison between non-employers and employers. Non-employers are in the dark And you'll notice that the blue is Colorado, and particularly recently, Colorado is outpacing the United States in non-employer growth. You'll notice that the growth of employers, traditional establishments, the ones that people usually think about that hire employees, have been much slower to grow. They got hit hard by the recession. Notice that the non-employers barely had a hiccup during the recession and picked up really quickly thereafter. It took employers, both in Colorado and the United States, a while to come back even to where they were before, and they're still growing much more slowly. Colorado is uniquely entrepreneurial and dynamic. This is small business density. So the number of companies per 1,000 residents, per person, basically. And you'll notice that the blue and red graphs basically show non-employers and employers. And we're outpacing the United States in terms of the number of businesses per person. We're basically very small business dense. Now, Denver is obviously a particular case in point and is particularly strong in both non-employers and employers, but Colorado is ahead in both non-employers and employers generally, not just in Denver. And rural areas, get back to rural areas are still pioneers in ways that I don't think people often appreciate. There is some farm legacy, but only 1/6 of rural establishments are farms. Even accounting for ag, rural areas are in fact more entrepreneurial than urban areas. And that surprises people in the cities in particular. The tech startups are not the norm, all right? And just to give you a sense of the graphics, on the left is the non-farm proprietors per 100 residents. And you'll notice that systematically, both in the US and in particular Colorado, micropolitan and particularly rural areas have more proprietors, more business owners per capita than urban areas. The fact is that rural areas have to be entrepreneurial. There's the big wage and salary employers, places like Walmart, for instance, or your local coal mine, are relatively rare. There's not going to be any big savior, as we talked about. The big employers are relatively scarce and anyways don't create as many jobs. And in rural areas, they need to be entrepreneurial. If you want a job in a rural area, you need to create one. So towns and residents have figured out ways to find their niche. And even more remarkable than that, not only is our rural areas more entrepreneurial, their entrepreneurs are more resilient. The 5-year survival rate is kind of the gold standard in economics. If you can make it past the first 5 years, your chances for success for long-term success are relatively great. And as it turns out, rural areas were more resilient over the Great Recession, which really did a lot of shakeout, which the COVID crisis has some similarities to. In any given year, up to 10% higher survival in rural areas. And again, taking a look at the graphic, rural areas are systematically, both in the US, have a business survival rate that is higher than in metropolitan areas. So the seedlings in that sense are already in your neighboring communities. The fact is that you may not realize that the small business owner is a key to your growth, but in fact, it really may be. So let's get back to COVID-19 in Colorado's rural areas. It's not a joke. This is a serious disease, and it's very contagious, and it has a high fatality rate for at-risk populations. The problem in rural areas is they have a lot of at-risk populations. The people who live there tend to be older with more chronic illness, including obesity. There's less healthcare infrastructure capacity. If in fact people get sick, rural hospitals have been closing, and so. In fact, getting care once you're diagnosed is even longer and more difficult than in urban areas. The virus may arrive later, as we talked about. Testing was relatively late in the game in rural areas, but it may hit hard. However, there is an however. The isolation does offer some protection. The relative contagion is relatively lower in sparser populations. Rural areas, as we talked about, have experienced being resilient. They are resilient. The Great Recession was a good indicator. And in the long term, as I hinted at the beginning, the COVID crisis may actually make cities less attractive and make sparser population itself an amenity. That small towns may actually become an amenity in themselves, that people would, as long as they can find work there, may be attracted to small towns. So here's some more resources. This is a really useful bit of information on how does the demographics of a community population matter, who is at risk, and what is the health sector's capacity to handle these dynamics. This is from ArcGIS. You can pull up these figures for health insurance coverage, for at-risk populations, for senior populations, for hospital beds. You can pick this up for any county in the United States, and it's really useful for planning. So I encourage you to take a look at that resource. here's the geography of the layoffs, and we've been hearing about a lot over the last few weeks. This is from early April, which is the most recent data that we have. And if you'll notice, that the Front Range, yes, got hit very hard. Larimer County, all the way down to Teller County, all through Denver. But the counties that are the most red, and this is what's pretty astonishing. This is the increase over the 2019 averages. The areas in red, Grand County, which is Winter Park, and Summit County, which includes Breckenridge, have more than 63 times the number of unemployment insurance claims than they did in 2019. That's those ski resorts are where this disease really started in Colorado being noticed, and as we know, the ski areas had to close early and were severely affected by it. But it's not just Grand and Summit County. You also have Eagle County and Vail. You have Routt County with Steamboat Springs, Gunnison County, and Durango and La Plata counties as well. So that's the geography of the layoffs. What type of industries? Well, they're basically service industries: accommodation and food services, arts, entertainment and recreation, retail, trade. All the ones that we've been hearing about have been having much higher rates of unemployment claims than Colorado as a whole, which is the orange line across the center there. Help wanted ads are another indication. There's only a few growing occupations, and they're the ones that you might not be surprised by: laborers and material movers, stock clerks, EMTs and paramedics, loan interviews, and pharmacists. Those are the growing occupations. But everywhere else, up to 80% loss in help wanted ads, and that's particularly true in food services: bartenders, waiters and waitresses at the bottom, dishwashers, cooks, hotel, motel, resort desk clerks. All of those are getting hit particularly hard because of the type of disease it is. People simply aren't traveling anymore, aren't going out to dinner, and they're staying in place as per state and national instruction. So pioneers guide the way forward. And as I said, rural areas have been pioneers in a lot of ways. They continue to be pioneers in terms of their entrepreneurialism. The fact is that job creation and destruction occur together. Job creation, about 1/3 of job creation comes from businesses just opening, fresh openings. And 1/3 of job destruction, or basically layoffs, come from closures. The fact is we're just not used to closures anymore. We've lived through the longest expansion in recent economic history, and we've had nothing but a lot of business openings and thus a lot of job creation. And that's something that the politicians like to tout. The fact is we're getting the other side of the bargain now. Recessions do occur, and they occur regularly, and that's when closures happen. That's when layoffs happen. But that's the reality of highly dynamic, churning, pioneering economies. Some of our research has taken a look at dynamism itself, not just job creation, not just business openings, but business closures, the business layoffs actually themselves create longer-term job growth. That dynamism is important. Businesses opening and closing are the dynamic nature of economies, and both of those together create long-term job growth. You can think of the economy as kind of a seed bed, and entrepreneurs as the seed. So if you scatter more seeds, you have more seeds. There are going to be more duds. Those are the closures. But the more seeds that you have, the better odds you have for a Google. So entrepreneurs really are conduits for new ideas, whether it be a new location, a new product, a new service. And failure is part of becoming a dynamic economy. I grew up in the Silicon Valley when there were still apple orchards in Palo Alto. And the idea in the Valley is, fail early, fail often. And it's a bit misleading, but the fact is that failure is part of the dynamic economy. And it is those places that are willing to deal with failure and make the best of it that actually do well. So if these entrepreneurs are so important, how do you get and keep these entrepreneurs? Well, what are your regional assets? Assets define your regional strengths and opportunities. And it can come in human form, it can come in natural form, or historic assets, and these create niches. There's one niche already in rural areas. The lower costs are attractive versus the high-priced Front Range. You can get much more of a house and much more property in rural areas than you can in the Front Range. Pooling and leveraging regional assets may be key. So it's not just each community itself, but the regional sum of communities may be greater than its parts. So for example, in Chaffee County, you have Salida, which has become an art district, which has a very well-known art district, and you have Buena Vista up the way that is a major hub for rafting. So the combination of assets in Chaffee County has made it actually one of the more successful rural counties in the state. The idea is to create a complementary set of assets and niches. And yes, we shouldn't forget the connections to the urban core. The fact is that the urban core is an economic engine. It's a really hot economic engine. Even these days, it will recover. And rural areas can think about linkages of innovating and linking to the Front Range economic engine in more inventive ways, and ways we can talk about momentarily. And interestingly, in talking to Mayor Hancock fully endorses this idea of spreading the growth out. It's one less car on I-25. If an entrepreneur decides to set up shop in a rural area, it's one less car on I-25. It's one less person bidding up housing prices. And the Denver mayor realizes that they're getting to capacity, and so is fully endorsing the idea of spreading the growth out. Entrepreneurship can often get lost in cities, but entrepreneurs, just one or two businesses can have real tangible impacts in smaller towns. Amenities do matter. It's important to attract and retain people, both natural and human. The amenities, both natural and human, are important for retaining people. You've got hills and mountains, which we're well known for, and coast, lakes, and rivers. Those are the ones that people tend to like. But there's also history and culture. Like I said, for example, blending Salida's art district with Buena Vista rafting. It's partially tourism, but it's also a way of attracting and retaining permanent residents, particularly younger people. Younger people who are willing to start businesses in new and innovative places. Old mining roads have been repurposed to become mountain biking havens and havens for winter sports. The idea is to emphasize your niche, which is likely already there. One of the things that Elizabeth has been talking a lot about through her travels throughout the state, and something that REDI has been looking at as well, is this idea of location-neutral business employees. For many occupations, for many types of industries, it doesn't matter where you are. You can work from just about anywhere. The internet can make small towns relatively attractive locations. And if crisis is, one of the things that the crisis has done is it's shown that much of the work can actually be done remotely. Things that weren't done remotely before now are being done remotely. And in fact, it makes, again, the idea of a location-neutral employee a much more attractive proposition. So where should programming focus? I think regional collaboration is really important. Take advantage of combined and leverage assets in your region. Increase the market scale for your local goods and services, both in terms of your region and to areas outside the region. And then pioneer these linkages to larger urban markets like in Denver. And we believe that at REDI, we've been talking a lot about Colorado as a pioneer in bridging the rural-urban divide. We've talked a lot. Well, there's been a lot of talk about the rural-urban divide, particularly politically. The fact is that Colorado is in a unique place to be able to bridge it, connecting the Front Range powerhouse to the rural regions. In eastern Colorado, there's lower costs, and it's relatively well connected in terms of infrastructure. Western Colorado has high amenities that tend to draw entrepreneurs and tend to keep them. So Colorado really could be a national pioneer, national leader in bridging the rural-urban divide. So to learn more about and access our resources, please visit us at our website to learn more about our specific COVID responses. We have the COVID resources page. And to learn more about our larger REDI team, we have the bios and contact page. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. We look forward to your questions. Before we do, actually, I think we would like to advertise next week's tourism webinars. So Dawn, do you want to take that?
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. And please do start. You can either ask questions in the chat box, or we can let you unmute yourself as well. But we did want to tell you, if you have been catching on, we're going to try to do one of these every week for a few weeks here. Because there's so many different parts of our community that are being affected by this event. So next week we'll be having, at this exact same time, 1 o'clock on Wednesday, a talk about tourism, including Jill Corbin from the Colorado Tourism Office, to talk about what they're facing and how they're looking at a pathway to recovery. But for now, we want to focus back on some of the many ideas that Stefan's kind of seeded, and specifically turn it over to Elizabeth to maybe also give some remarks about what they're seeing and what kind of conversations are happening at the state level. But please also do not be shy and ask questions or tell us if you'd like to talk. And in addition to remarks she might already have prepared, I think she's ready to answer any question along with Stefan. So I'll turn it back over to them, but we'll leave up this slide in case you want to take down information for next week. Elizabeth, I'll ask you questions if you don't have things prepared. You looked at
I
me
didn't
kind
know
of
where.
like with deer eyes.
Go ahead.
Did you have some things you wanted to say, or can we start with questions?
You can start with questions, and I have a couple of comments, but I'd be curious more on where, if you've got a question or anybody else.
Well, as Stefan talked, I guess the thing that popped to mind for me the most clearly was, as you have been a part of conversation, well, even before this event happened, and Stefan's remarked on a couple of things your office has done, but particularly with conversations happening at the state level, where do you see Colorado being particularly resilient and having some ability to weather this event better, or in fact, perhaps even might have a region benefit from it that we kind of always knew was a sleeper or had some potential out there, but this particular event's going to put us in a particularly good place?
So I guess I have two thoughts on that. We've been talking about, at least in our office and a lot of different groups, how well do we think Colorado will do compared to other states? And, it's got two different components going for it. One, it was kind of going into this whole situation better than most states. So definitely, we would say in the top 10, maybe even in the top 7 performing states in the US. So it had that momentum going forward, which I think it can still live on partially. But then we also looked at some of the industries that Stefan was talking about that were very vulnerable to COVID, those being a lot in the service industries, the accommodations, food service, and arts, entertainment, recreation. And Colorado actually has a higher location quotient for that. So a higher proportion of our jobs in those industries compared to the US average. So if those are going to be long run problem industries, we could actually potentially fare worse than other states. Now I'm going to kind of give you the demographic side of it. So that's the economic side. On the demographic side, Stefan also mentioned this concept of maybe people seeing more rural places or less densely populated areas as potential locations to go to. So 3 of our largest trading partners in terms of population are California, New York, Texas, and I'm not going to talk necessarily about them right now, and Washington State. And so we could easily, and we've heard anecdotally already, that Colorado could actually end up attracting more folks, especially from New York. We could also see maybe more people coming to here from California, or less people leaving Colorado to go to California. So we could be a natural draw to some of the states that we're already big trading partners with. So we could get more people. However, also on that demographic side is that we knew that things were slowing down. Colorado was becoming a little bit less competitive, especially because of price, with some of its neighboring states, but again, still competitive for those larger trading partners being California and New York primarily. So I think, a lot of us are really questioning and concerned and curious as to how well will Colorado perform, and how resilient are we. I think the whole US is going to be challenged because so much of our industries are turning toward those service-based industries, and services require people then creates that interaction. And so how quickly can we pivot to that service industry, but in a more protected way? Because I don't think that, certainly not in the short run is this going away anytime soon, and really it could become a very recurring situation. So thinking about resilience of industries, resilience of communities, I think is going to be really important. And how do you plan, or at least do scenarios for what are all the different possibilities out there? So that was my very long-winded response to your first question.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I have a question. I hope this isn't too pointed of a question here, but I was wondering, and Stefan already touched on this a little bit, so maybe he'd be good to answer it as well with the gig employers, but looking at what's going on in some of these rural areas and knowing who's on this call, we have a lot of extension agents and individuals that do community development in rural areas. Do you see any strategies or any bright spots or programming or something like that that might be able to be highlighted to help as we move out of this issue? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. You know, the big piece that I will focus on is, especially I think in what you would consider smaller economies and maybe more rural economies, is just potentially their ability to pivot quicker. I think there's a better communication and connection between local governments, the public health offices, businesses, the economic development community. I think it's a much more tight-knit group. And so coming up with those strategies and kind of business plans for how do you do things differently can potentially move much more quickly in rural Colorado than maybe in the urban areas. And because the firms are smaller, maybe being able to pivot more quickly, because I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to take, you know, ingenuity, ability to think quickly and pivot your business plans. The other piece that I'll bring up, and it's not necessarily part of your question, but one of the areas that I know DOLA, Department of Local Affairs, that we're really watching is local governments. And local governments, and I know we've got extension agents on the call, is looking at the resilience of local governments, especially when it comes to their fiscal capacity. So many, especially municipalities, being hit with the downturn in retail sales, which tends to be their, you know, primary funding for operations, is really looking at how do we help support the local governments in all of these areas, because they're the ones that aren't necessarily getting all of the support, where you're getting more directly at the person, directed at the business, but not necessarily as much directed at the local government. And so I think that's something that, you know, statewide, and then, you know, thinking about our education institutions, that we can be thinking about is how do we best support our local governments.
Thank you.
I have a question for both Stefan and Elizabeth. Our audience is being quiet, so I'll just keep talking. But I guess the one, and this is kind of a segue to next week's topic about tourism, I guess the one alarming thing to me was, and I totally understood it, is some rural counties that have those great natural resource amenities that Stefan talked about had to go so far as to kind of close down county boundaries during the height of this event. And, you know, necessarily, and again, I think it was Coloradans with very good intentions of like, get away from congestion, go to a place where I can minimize my contact anyway, which again was a benefit to those communities, perhaps if there was traffic, but they purposefully didn't even have a way to spend money there if they wanted to support the community. So I think some of them shut down, but you know, how given what is looking like a very slow transition out of this event, stay at home and to safer at home, to gradually letting us out again, how are rural communities thinking about how to do that safely, wisely, and in the spirit of keeping public health top of mind, but still trying to secure some of the economic activity they obviously need to sustain themselves? Because this is, again, just an unprecedented event where we've never had this kind of joint concern about keeping our economy going, but having public health be top of mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the answer is, I mean, around the national monuments, national parks, and and all of the areas that we know. I mean, it is more sparsely populated. The ability to social distance, you know, I mean, I think people, you know, for example, people's visitations to national parks actually go up during recessions because because alternative travel becomes difficult. I mean, it's going to be a while until, you know, Europe and Asia and that sort of thing will, I think the in-state and interstate travel will probably pick up much faster than the international travel. So I think in that sense, Colorado is poised, you know, rural Colorado, especially those with those amenities, is actually poised to take advantage of that. Because I think that the international travel aspect of it will especially towards crowded, you know, sites like London, Paris, and that sort of thing, will deter people for quite a long time, longer than it will take to take a hike out in Colorado.
You know, and my 2 cents on it is that, at least through our lens in the Department of Local Affairs, what we're seeing is that most local governments and communities, so even, you know, within the county boundaries, are really looking at coming up with new operation plans. And so they're looking at how are they going to open. And so, you know, the thing that I think is really important is that every county is really unique, and their issues and their ability to tackle problems are very unique. And so, you know, there's a reasons why they closed the national parks, because we weren't behaving ourselves when we went there. And, you know, so knowing the behavior of your clients, knowing what other risks you have. You know, Stefan mentioned the aging population, but, you know, I don't know how many people were looking at, you know, prison communities and then communities that have like large meat processing, you know, that those were going to be 2 big outbreak components. You've got the whole tourism related areas where, you know, maybe they've got a little extra capacity, you know, because their health services are actually designed for more when they've got tourism there. So, you know, it's looking at how would Eagle do this different than La Plata, that would do it different than Morgan. And I think that's what's really important, is looking at these kind of individual plans for each county and local government to see how well they can best manage the problem, but then get as much open as possible, is, you know, the balancing that I think a lot of places are looking at.
Thanks. Well, and with that, I think we did not have any questions pop up in the group chat. Is there anybody who can unmute and just ask one by voice?
Yes, thank you. This is Lila Hansen. Can you hear me?
We can perfectly.
I'm in Montezuma County. I'm a realtor. I've remodeled over a dozen houses. I'm an entrepreneur. I've recently taken the Leading Edge course. I've been interested in hemp. I'm working with a group that grew, therefore CBD. I try to help people become employed where I can. The question is as follows. Within the opportunity which is coming, how can we assess the opportunity, because there's so much that will be lost at this time? So is economic development in your world working on those areas of economic opportunity that we should all focus on in terms of the new dynamic and the new employment opportunity? Or are we still in this phrase of trying to get a handle on it? You talk about the strength of the rural communities. There are those, but mostly people are very independent and they're very self-motivated. And at a time like this, they're a little bit lost because the way that they've invested their time and their resources is non-applicable. So the question really is, how are you looking at the future in terms of growth industries that are logical for rural areas? And is there a resource we can go to look at that?
I can move down to we have a map. We have a mapping of these are the non-employer. These are the non-employers. These are basically the entrepreneurs out there. And what you'll notice, and what you'll notice is, for example, Colorado is unusually concentrated on the concentration is the most important part. Just the right-left. You know, basically the horizontal axis. So being far on the right makes you more concentrated than the nation as a whole. And you'll notice that professional, scientific, and technical services were very heavily concentrated, and that is the sector that has the most remote work possibilities. You'll notice we're also pretty big in information, educational services, and that sort of thing. So, you know, we think about these. We use this graphic to try to figure out sort of where are the employers what are the employment sectors like to be? Where are the entrepreneurs now, and where are we likely to see the growth later? We have these, if you're interested, this is among our REDI reports, and you'll have the slideshow as well. So you're happy to either speak more about it now, but you can also take a look at it at your leisure.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is, I'm doing a screenshot of where we are right now. I think that's tremendous because part of it is trying to get a sense of where the future is headed. And of course, you are in the driver's seat as far as actually understanding the data. So I thank you for that. The more you can do in that regard, the better we're poised for making some decisions.
And for all of you, obviously, if you phoned in today, you're interested in this. The Department of Local Affairs of Colorado has, even before this event, was starting a new resiliency framework for not how just to make us a bigger economy state, but a more resilient economy state. I just got looped into that and was part of the first event, but I would say definitely there's a website for it. I don't have it on hand, so I can't post it, but I would stay attuned to that. And I think they're even looking for active partnership. And so if some of you want to be involved in that effort, I think they're, so far they're kind of framing it with some of us who they think of as being the folks that would help frame them what they're going to do. But I think that is that initiative that was already taking shape before COVID has found a new identity. And it's exactly what you brought up, Leila, is as good as we were positioned in the momentum we had, how do we cleverly then figure out where we should be targeting our energies and our programming to make sure we land as softly as we can. And as Elizabeth said, it's going to be a little tough for Colorado because every place you all sit is experiencing this so much differently that if they don't have pretty local voices explaining what that means in their space, it's going to be pretty hard to do. So please follow up with me if you can't find that, and we'll get you connected.
I appreciate that very much. Yes, terrific. For instance, I'm looking into what is 3D printing, what is doing printed masks and respirator 3D printing. There's so much we can do, and there are people already undertaking this. So it's just really a matter of connection and continuity, pulling it together.
That's a really good example, actually.
Thank you. I'll follow up.
Okay, thanks. Please do.
Yep, you bet.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you everybody for attending. I'll give one last opportunity. Are there any other questions from anybody out there that they want to put towards Stefan or Elizabeth?
This is Lila again. I'd like to thank you very much for what you're doing. And I look forward to your next one, and I will work on having more people attend your next meeting. I appreciate it.
And we'll be recording this one. This one is being recorded, so people will be able to access it on our website too. So please, encourage people to take a look.
Great.
Yes, thank you everybody for attending. And as Stefan said, we'll be recording this and we will post it on the REDI webpage. So thanks again, everyone.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.